Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third in a series of talks sponsored by the Utah Criminal Justice Center and the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. I'm Dr. Emily Salisbury, the new director for the Utah Criminal Justice Center, and I'm thrilled to be able to facilitate this conversation among our very esteemed speakers today. I'm grateful to be a part of a university that's not afraid to have challenging conversations about controversial topics, particularly around issues involving race in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. A word about the Utah Criminal Justice Center. We're a collaborative partnership between the University of Utah's College of Social Work, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and the College of Social and Behavioral Science. UCJC also has a long-standing partnership with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice that supports interdisciplinary research, teaching, and training. Our center works towards reducing crime and victimization, inspiring sound public policy and fair treatment, and providing a model of higher education that promotes good governance through independent, nonpartisan research and innovative programs. Our primary goal in these talks is to create a constructive community dialogue among local public service leaders informed by the research of nationally recognized scholars. Today, that scholar is Dr. Patricia Warren from Florida State University. With these events, we're also inviting the community to reject apathy and complacency and to dare to care about these issues, no matter what your perspective is. After all, if we can't facilitate open-minded dialogue with an eye toward viewpoint diversity on a college campus, then I'm not really sure where we can. And while we certainly are not going to solve such challenging problems in our time today, we hope to provide a more sophisticated, evidence-based dialogue about these topics compared to what we generally see elsewhere. These are highly complex issues, so complex that I'd be surprised if we all agreed on the solutions or even what exactly the problems are. But just as we ask our students to enter our classrooms with an open mind, we're asking that audience members do the same. I'm heartened by the fact that perhaps now more than ever, people want to engage and protest and activate their lives towards social change. As we move forward as a community, it's my hope that the Utah Criminal Justice Center will continue to be called upon to find solutions. For instance, we are currently hard at work as an evaluator for the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice and the juvenile courts on the statewide non-judicial adjustment project, in an effort to identify diversionary practices to reduce the number of children in Utah entering the juvenile justice system. The center is in a unique position to significantly contribute to building and evaluating possible solutions given the strength of our board and our staff. As we get started, I also want to point the audience to the Q&A and chat functions that are available to you. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please submit it to the QA function and we'll do our best to answer it. If you have a general comment or resource you'd like to point others to, please use the chat function for that purpose. With all this in mind, it's my pleasure to finally introduce you to our esteemed speakers today. Dr. Patricia Warren received her PhD in 2005 from North Carolina State University and is currently a professor in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University. Her research explores the salience of race and ethnicity as an organizing principle that shapes how social control and punishment are applied in the criminal justice system. Her current projects assess the school-to-prison pipeline and the effect of historical processes on contemporary crime and justice outcomes, including arrests and incarceration. Her research has appeared in some of the top journals in criminology, including Criminology, Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, Justice Quarterly, and Race and Justice. We're so very fortunate to have Dr. Warren with us today to educate us further in this conversation. And turning to our other esteemed speakers, Dr. Van Nguyen has been with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice since 2017, where she started as the Disproportionate Minority Contact Coordinator, and since then has transitioned to a research consultant. In her current role, she serves as a member of the research team and supports the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee in the monitoring and implementation of juvenile justice reform. She received her PhD in social work right here from the U at the University of Utah. Thanks so much for coming back to join us, Dr. Nguyen. Brett Peterson is the Director of Utah Juvenile Justice Services. He's responsible for the operation and management of the continuum of care, including early intervention, shelter, detention, and long-term secure settings. As director, Brett is committed to reducing the need for out-of-home placements, correlating the services provided with the leading research related to adolescent brain development, and ongoing implementation of significant juvenile justice reforms. During his time as director, Brett has overseen the shift of significant resources and practices to serve youth in their homes, schools, and communities. He began his career with the Department of Human Services as an in-house assistant attorney general, where he worked with youth residential providers to reduce silos and improve access to services. Following this role, Brett was the director of the Office of Licensing, leading efforts to create an efficient and effective approach to health and safety monitoring, and to drive system-wide solutions to achieve better results for youth and families. Derek Mueller is a senior research analyst in our very own Utah Criminal Justice Center at the University of Utah. He's also completing a doctoral degree in criminal justice at the University of Cincinnati. He's worked on several federal and state-funded research projects that include work with data and staff from law enforcement agencies, juvenile courts, and correctional facilities. One of Derek's projects examined risk assessment implementation and youth outcomes across 3 states, which was funded by the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. He also recently wrapped up a study examining disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system at the arrest and referral points of contact in Utah. He also served on a project that examined the extent to which disproportionate minority contact existed at several points in the Ohio juvenile justice system. His recent publications have appeared in top criminology journals, and most importantly, he just added a new member of his family, baby Oliver. I'm excited to meet him, Derek. Thanks so much for contributing to the discussion. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to Dr. Warren to give us a presentation on her scholarship. I've asked Dr. Warren to spend about 15 or 20 minutes presenting, and then we'll open it up to the panelists for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. While I get set up here, I just want to thank you, the UC-JC Center and Dr. Salisbury, for inviting me to talk about these important issues. I'm very excited. This project is actually something that started with a grant I received from the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, who is responsible for studying DMC every 5 years. And so they somewhat did a data dump where they provided all the information about the referrals, the nature of referrals, who's getting arrested, what's happening to the kids in terms of disposition. And so I've taken a portion of that to talk about the school to prison pipeline. So today, my presentation is entitled Disproportionate Minority Contact in the School to Prison Pipeline, thinking about the problems and the strategies for moving forward. So disproportionate minority contact, as most of you know, is basically the overrepresentation of minority youth in the justice system. And in 1988, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice basically addressed DMC by requiring states that receive formula grants to study this issue. And Florida was one of the first states to actually participate in this. And so that's why I think Florida is a very good context for having this conversation. So what is it we know? We know that Black youth are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, much like we know adults. Minority adults are overrepresented. So 17%, Black youth represent 17% of all youth in the United States, represent 31% of all referrals. And they have 2 times the rate of whites and 3 times the rate of Latinos of actually being referred. And so my thinking, or one of the things we've been trying to do in Florida, is to think about what are the mechanisms or what are potential factors that we believe actually influence or contribute to disproportionate minority contact. And one of the things that we've identified in Florida is schools. schools are a major point of contact, in part because the juvenile justice system in some ways paralleled the adult system in becoming more punitive. So when we see in the 1990s where we started to see the drug war, there was lots of concerns about drugs and violence in schools. We saw that school districts across the United States adopted what we call what they've called zero tolerance policies. And these policies were initially geared toward identifying violent offenders or drug offenders and to remove those kids from the school environment, that they were disruptive to the school. We should remove them in order to keep the school safe. What this has ultimately turned into is it increased the surveillance of kids in schools. I mean, some schools have metal detectors, locker searches, and in Florida, one of the things that we've seen is there's been a mass push towards having resource officers. And resource officers have been the direct connection between Florida schools and Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. Because once you insert resource officers into the school setting, you're basically introducing the juvenile justice system, or at least a portion of the system, into the school environment. And so what we've done, or what we've seen in Florida, at least early on, was that schools started to criminalize kids for things that at one point used to be handled by school administrators. So there's really two ways when we think about the pipeline, or at least for the context of this presentation, I'm thinking about two ways the pipeline can work. And one can be through suspensions, and that kids who get suspended from school have more time by themselves. Kids who get suspended from school have more time to be unsupervised, and that unsupervised time allows opportunity for them to get into mischievous behavior. It is also the case that for some kids, suspending them from school becomes the mechanism for not caring about school or feeling like school administrators and teachers don't care about them. So sometimes removing kids from the school environment can actually be a risk factor in and of itself for criminal justice contact. And the other way is through school-based referrals, that in schools where kids are deemed to be problematic. So in Florida, basically talking back to a teacher can lead to a resource officer arresting the kid and being charged with disorderly conduct, which would be a misdemeanor in Florida. So those kinds of ways in which we criminalize young people have consequences for what I believe is a long-term trajectory into the justice system. And so there's been there's been quite a few studies out there, but I've just highlighted two of them, that we know disparities are present in school misbehavior, even when, or the punishment for this misbehavior is present, even when there's not much difference between between Black, white, and Latino students' misbehavior in schools. The way in which kids or minority kids get perceived when they are misbehaving or acting out is sometimes handled much differently than we see majority youth. And so there was a study done by Jennifer Eberhardt. You might actually know her. She is a professor at Stanford who received a huge grant to study the way in which police officers actually respond to minority adults compared to whites, and that in her study of adults, she found that police officers were much more likely to shoot when it was a person of color than when it was a non-person of color. Similarly, what she found in an experiment with teachers, she and her co-author found that teachers were much more likely to recommend suspensions for Black students, even when they committed the same infraction as white students. So some of it is about the ways in which behavior gets interpreted, or misbehavior gets interpreted and punished at the level of the school. So why do these disparities exist? I've highlighted one issue that I think is important, and I think oftentimes we don't spend enough attention talking about it, and it's segregation. So on average, Black kids and white kids don't live in the same kinds of communities. Black kids are much more likely to live in, or Black citizens are much more likely to live in neighborhoods 29% white, 54% Black. So the majority of their neighborhoods tend to be people of color. And the average white person lives in a neighborhood that is 81% white. And that means that they're oftentimes going to different kinds of schools. And then that has consequences for busing. So in North Carolina, where I'm actually from, there was a huge initiative to bus kids from across town as a way of integrating schools. The way they leveled the playing field was to say, even though the neighborhoods are segregated, we'll find a way to integrate schools. But the integration in and of itself means you have more minority kids going into spaces that were overwhelmingly dominated by majority kids. And the teachers oftentimes don't reflect the diversity of the student population. And so their behavior gets interpreted differently. I think we just don't spend enough time thinking about the way race works around segregation and what it means when you bus kids as a mechanism for integrating, which I'm not opposed to at all. But what happens in that school environment when the kids can be sometimes seen as outsiders. Sometimes if a minority kid talks back, it gets perceived differently than when a majority kid talks back. So what does this look like in Florida? So the Florida juvenile justice process or referral process from school looks a little like this. So a kid misbehaves, you have a resource officer on site. The school administrator will call the resource officer in, so it has to be a teacher or administrator. They call the resource officer in. The resource officer decides whether or not they're going to arrest the kid on the site or if they're going to cite them. So there becomes two ways in which a referral can happen. In this instance, for the most part, these kids were arrested on site. And then there is a Florida DJJ assessment process. They can get a full screen assessment or a partial screen. And it's usually the assessment officer making the decision around what that's going to look like. They ask them a series of questions depending upon the nature of the offense that they've been, or at least allegedly they committed. Then they will make a determination about what kind of assessment the kid needs. In Florida, we use what's known as the PACT form. And the PACT form provides information about families, school, their current enrollment at school, their grades. It asks them a whole series of questions, and how many of those questions get asked will depend upon at what risk the assessing officer decides. And then the Florida state attorney comes in and decides how that case is going to proceed. And so what I will present from this point forward is just what the numbers look like in Florida. So what you see is over time, so these data represent from 2006 to 2015, over time, the number of referrals for all groups have declined and have significantly declined and have continued to decline even since 2015. I'll talk a little bit about what was going on between 2010 and 2011, which is where we see kind of the steepest decline. Some of that is tied to civil citations, and it's also tied to there being great criticism of criminalizing kids. There was a national discussion about the criminalization of kids in schools and its impact on minority kids. And so when we look at what do school referrals look like, you see that on average, 45,000 African Americans or Black children, 13,000 Latinos, and 30,000 whites were referred from school from 2006 to 2015. And what you'll see across all these slides are Black students are more likely to be referred, and Black students are more likely to be referred from school. And so what are the kinds of crimes for which they get referred for? So they're classified really, you can have an infraction, a misdemeanor, or felony. For the purposes of our study, I'm using misdemeanors and felonies. It's the easiest to describe. So there were 54,000 misdemeanors. And so what this suggests, just off the cuff, is that overwhelmingly kids are not being referred for violent offenses. That's the first thing. Because we had a total of 89,000 referrals to schools across this 10-year time period, 54,000 of them are for misdemeanors. And you see, again, that minority youth represent, or at least Black youth represent 50% of the misdemeanors, and Latinos represent 15%. And we see this pattern, to be truthful, we see this pattern across all the years of study and across, I don't care what we are looking at in Florida, the Latino youth tend to be underrepresented. And some of this, or more represented in terms of their actual student population numbers, and some of this is just about what we tend to think of the Latino enclave. There's some protective factors for Latinos in these communities. And so the criminalization is really around Black youth, but we also see white youth also being referred. It's just not as many of them. And so when we look at felonies, there were 34,000 felonies, and 52% of them were Black youth and 32% were whites. And so on average, Blacks are much more likely to be referred for both misdemeanors and felonies. And so I think suspensions are an important part of this conversation, because I think that suspensions provide information to a judge when making a decision about how committed that kid is in school. Like, what is this kid doing? Is this kid disruptive to the school environment? What kinds of things, programs can you implement for the kids? And so out of the 89,000 kids, only about 9,700 of them were suspended at the time that they were actually referred. So the time that they went before the prosecutor, were they in school or had the school suspended them for some reason? And so what you see is that, again, on average, the number of suspensions for Blacks exceed that for both whites and Latinos. And so what I've done here is to try to look at diversion. I focus in particular on diversion decisions because they tend to be the much more discretionary decision. Diversion is what most kids get in Florida, but I wanted to know how suspensions affect the diversion process. And I looked at this effect for both misdemeanors and suspensions, and I presented it this way just for ease of interpretation. And so there were 2,700 kids who committed misdemeanors and were also currently suspended. And what we see is that the Black kids and the white kids on average are diverted about at the same rate. I don't have the rates up here, but basically the rates are about the same, despite the fact you have to suspend more Black kids and you have to refer more Black kids in order to get similar percentages here. And when we look at felonies, we see the very same kind of effect, that even though on average, Black kids are suspended more and are referred for felonies, they're basically being diverted at the same rate of whites. Now, what does this mean? Like, some might say, well, diversion is a good thing for Black kids, or diversion is a good thing for all kids. I agree. Diversion is a very good thing, but the introduction into the justice system in and of itself can be enough to create a pathway for these young people. So it's not just about the behavior, but it's about how the behavior gets handled in the context of schools, and then how that influences, long-term participation in terms of the juvenile justice system. What I think here, this is nothing more than me just summarizing what I told you. On average, Black students have more referrals. They're much more likely to be subjected to school referrals for both felonies and misdemeanors. And they have similar likelihoods of being diverted, despite the fact Black kids on average are being referred to the system at higher numbers. And I think this is just an important place to put a kickstand. Because I think if we see similar patterns, but you're referring more, that means you're subjecting the Black kids to this process more frequently. And what's interesting about this, when I was working on this analysis with me and my co-author, my colleague, Dr. Stewart, I reminded him that when I was a graduate student, I was a part of a racial profiling project in North Carolina, where we received a couple of $100,000 to study racial profiling amongst the highway patrol. And we found a similar pattern that, okay, so what determines whether or not a police is going to arrest an individual? So what they were doing is they were subjecting more Black drivers to stops in order to get the same rate of arrest as whites, or the same rate of finding contraband. So if you stop 2 times more Blacks, you'll get the same rate as stopping, whites at the level of their population. And so what it means is, so some might interpret that and say, well, that's good. That means we don't really have disparity. Well, you really do, because you're subjecting them to more stops in order to get the numbers that you actually, or in order to get parity between the numbers. And so where do we go from here? And I think this is where the conversation gets a little bit more complicated. I think in 2014, the U.S. Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter to school administrators across the United States, basically saying, look, you need to reduce the number of suspensions. We're suspending 3 million kids a year. It's ridiculous. You need to find alternative ways for dealing with misbehavior. And the other thing the Dear John letter addressed was that schools needed to attend to the racial and ethnic disparities in school discipline. And so what does all this mean? I think you can have school safety without constantly referring kids to the justice system and without relying on punishment as the primary mechanism for punishing kids. And the other thing, I'll note civil citations. So in Florida, we implemented, and that's what happened around 2010 and 2011 when you started to see the decline. We started using what we call civil citations. And civil citations is, we're going to issue a citation for what you did, but it's not going to give you a criminal record. So in Florida, if you get arrested at school, that is an official record. It does not matter if it gets dismissed. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. It is, so basically, if the military calls and says, this person is interested in joining the military, do you have a record? Even if the case was dismissed, DJJ would still have to say, yes, this kid or this adult has a criminal record. Civil citations block that because they say, okay, for minor offenses, it doesn't make sense. So in cases of violence, it makes sense that kids need to get referred. I'm not suggesting that the system serves no purpose at all. I'm simply suggesting that for minor behavior, which is what most of these kids are really being sent to the system for, there's got to be alternative ways for dealing with their misbehavior. And on that note, I thank you for inviting me to talk about my work. I welcome any questions you have or any suggestions you have moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. You've given us a lot to think about, particularly certainly with, of course, students of color. So I'd like to open it up just to the rest of the panelists, and we'll get to the Q&A coming in from the audience after that. So anybody would like to chime in, please do so.
Well, I think that, thank you, Dr. Hightower. I really appreciated that. And, unfortunately, I mean, Utah's data, and I'll let others on the panel who have more expertise in that, it's not going to look any different. And it's, in some situations, it looks worse. I think the disparity, the great news in Utah is, we've had dramatic juvenile reform where we've drastically shrunk, I guess, say the doorways of how youth can come into care. We've shrunk the populations. I know today, so kind of giving a relative, a relativistic footprint for our population. In long-term settings, I have less than 80 kids in those settings statewide. But in detention, pre-adjudication detention, jail, I've got about 50 kids statewide is all. So that's a significant, stride we've made, but it has not, the disparity is still significant. The disproportionality is still significant. Speaking about this school aspect, I think for me, like you said, getting to the trickier part of the conversation, what do we do about it? And I think it does start with having a lens on equity in everything that we examine and evaluate, acknowledging the disparity or disproportionality, whatever's existing, and often it's both. And then every policy that's coming through, we have to raise this issue and we have to consider it and say, look, I'll give an example. I mean, this was something from last legislative session. They're passing it was a texting and driving type law, which I think most people on its merits, we all were kind of like, yeah, like we can, for a lot of reasons, we can get behind this. but also recognizing that if it follows the same patterns that we've identified, it's going to have disproportionate application, which then will trigger off these disparate outcomes. So just being willing to acknowledge that and raise it, looking at the schools, you know, Utah, this is kind of where it intersects with COVID, which is just interesting. You know, nobody, and this is schools, I mean, I've had conversations with all of my school partners, none of us paused and recognized, you know, we have a public health order that requires masks. Well, if you don't wear a mask, that's automatically a misdemeanor B. You know, it can be referred as a misdemeanor B for violating a public health order. Well, we didn't think about that. Oh, all of a sudden now that's going to be in schools. And, you know, our experience is that the population that's going to end up getting referred, if they get referred, it will be Black and brown youth. It will be kids with, you know, high mental health needs. It'll be these disadvantaged communities. And so, you know, those are the types of, I think, conversations we just have to be willing to engage in, embark on, and saying, look, we have to own this.
Yeah.
We have to own that this is what's happened and continues to happen, because then we can actually honestly, you know, consider our policies from that equitable lens.
I couldn't agree more. And I have a lot to say, but I'm going to stay quiet.
Thank you for that. I think, you know, working now in a policy landscape, it's so refreshing that we can put race at the forefront of our discussion. And so my question is to Dr. Warren, how do we fight that battle of the narrative, though? And one example is, you know, I read an article the other day, Brian Stevenson mentioned, you know, during the Civil War, the North may have won the battle, but the South won the battle of the narrative. And I see this to be true when we do pass, you know, back in 1974, when the Office of Juvenile Justice, Delinquency and Prevention Office passed to deinstitutionalize status offenses. We see that what was left was still youth of color in confinement. And similarly in Utah, a report that was recently published in our office, along with other stakeholders, are looking at the issue of race, which is we passed juvenile justice reform. It was aimed to reduce these disparities, and yet we still see the same, if not worsening, of these disparities. And so the question is, when we pass such reform and we want to do good policies with good intentions, but yet that battle of the narrative, the battle where we, you know, there was a question, how do we educate school administrators about disparities in discipline? We prevented low-level status offenses from entering truancy, and yet that narrative of punishing youth and punishing youth of color and depicting Black and brown bodies as violence or as a need to be punished, that narrative still exists. And so, I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded question, but I hope you can share some of your perspective on that.
Sure. So I think a couple of things about this. One is, I don't think we do enough partnerships. So our conversations, our policyholders are having a conversation about what should happen, and then researchers are over here saying, but let me tell you what you're really doing. I know what you tried to do, but this is really the outcome of what you're doing. We're not good at that. We're not good at bringing it to the table. And sometimes I think researchers, including myself, are often not good about how can we say it in plain language? Like, how can we take our statistical models and just say, look, let me tell you what you're really doing with these kids. You may have been well-intentioned, but the outcome has created disparate outcomes for these minority children, and it is having deleterious effects on all kinds of outcomes. So that's the first thing. In terms of the narrative, I think data are really the conversation piece. So in Florida, the FSU has created a partnership with the Florida Senate, where every bill that has come on the floor, and we just started this partnership, we do a disproportionate impact on minority communities. So what is the disparate impact going to look like? Now, it's crazy that we're doing this on every bill, because we basically have a 3-day turnaround. They go into a meeting, they have a 3-day turnaround to say to them, this is what it's going to look like. That's the kind of work and forethought that I think states have to start considering. You have to think about, because for everything you do, somebody is going to have a disparate impact on someone. You have to decide, or some community, you have to decide how big of impact you want to have on that community and how you can minimize the more long-term consequences of it. The narrative is always sometimes about what's rhetorical, like what's easy to say, like what the media can put in a quick soundbite. And even on Senate floors, I've not, done much of that work, but Brett, I bet you have, where you're trying to talk to them and they want you to say it in 2 minutes. You got 2 minutes to sum it up. And it's hard to do this work in 2 minutes. It's hard to say, what it is in 2 minutes. But I think it's complicated in terms of narrative, because some of the narrative is about what people bring from their local jurisdictions. Sometimes it's about policymakers being concerned about being elected to just getting reelected, so they have to reinforce a narrative that's that's of their constituents. It's a complicated question, but I think there are small things that can be done in agencies that, for instance, going to school administrators and actually saying to them, let me tell you what you're really doing to the minority kids. And despite the fact, when I look at the data, I know you're saying the minority kids are really bad, but you're really referring them for misdemeanors or infractions, things that in the 80s, by all accounts, the kid would just go to in-school suspension and that would be the end of the conversation. So I think it requires, it's a lot of work, but I do think partnerships are an important way that we can talk to school administrators and teachers and help them come up with alternatives within your local community about how to handle misconduct. For instance, I know you've seen in Florida, there's been crazy things in Florida, but there was a kid who refused to put her phone down. They called the resource officer on her because she refused to put her phone down. And that interaction escalated into something more than it actually needed to be. And it was all over a cell phone. Now, was she on her cell phone and she should have gotten off her cell phone? Absolutely. But did the teacher have to really call the school resource officer because she wouldn't get on? And she wasn't talking on the cell phone. She was literally texting. And the teacher just didn't like it. And so I think we have to help train teachers about how to also handle misbehavior that doesn't interject the resource officer into every situation with these young people. And I'm not being unfair. I just want to say, I don't want to be unfair to teachers and school administrators because the work they do is hard. They do a hard job. They have a lot of kids in a class trying to ensure that they learn, and they have integrate testing in Florida. If the kid doesn't pass, then they're going to fail the grade. There's all kinds of pressures placed on teachers. And so I don't want to blame them. I think that it's through partnerships, though, that we can help educate them about alternative ways for handling misbehavior.
I want to just tag on to that a little. I really do think that's key. And I mean, that's been a huge takeaway for Utah. I think, like I said, Utah's juvenile justice, I do think there are many aspects of our system that are, some of the best in the nation and models for states of how to approach delivering these types of services, to youth. But one thing that was a big lesson learned, from reform, like you had this dramatic kind of policy change that created clear constraints on the system, but ensuring that there is that connectivity of partnerships and resources. Here in Utah, the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee has been really critical in that space. That's a body, it's got, myself and members of the court from the state school board, law enforcement, where we can kind of come together and be able to discuss. Doesn't mean we always agree, right? But we can at least have a forum to flesh out the issues. And then I know from my systems lens, something that's been really critical is standing up deliberate and responsive resources and services for whether it's schools, whether it's for law enforcement. So it's the law enforcement analogy is easiest. It's one thing to tell a law enforcement officer, okay, you can't book a kid in detention for X, Y, and Z. It's another thing to say, you can't book them for X, Y, and Z, but you can bring them here to this receiving center. We'll take it from there. We'll connect them to services. We'll be the warm hand. And that's something where here in Utah, we've been able to, where I'm really, really hopeful over the next couple of years, we're pivoting lots of resources to our front end, to what we call our youth services, where a school administrator, again, they can get connected for some of that kind of case management, where you can get, services to kids, but it doesn't involve any of these more formal pathways that we just traditionally depended on. And I think that that'll be a dynamic, a relationship that will continue to unfold.
Yeah, I'd like to also just kind of add a few things. So, at the Utah Criminal Justice Center, we partnered with the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice to conduct an evaluation. Essentially, we were looking at the arrest and referral decision points and, among the juvenile justice system. And the goal of that study was to kind of draft some long-term kind of longitudinal analysis of the RRIs and how things have changed. So really kind of drilling down a bit on the rates that we're seeing, a variety of different non-white groups compared to whites, how they were being arrested and referred in the juvenile justice system. And I think to Brett's point, we've seen that disparity continue to be there, to exist. And in some instances, it has gotten better for some subgroups of the population, but it's highly varied across different jurisdictions in the state. So we thought, we're going to present these figures to CCJJ and kind of work with them and to develop a survey to kind of reach out to law enforcement officers and get their perceptions of DMC, really kind of ask them what it is that they think are driving the DMC that they're seeing. And we asked a number of questions related to DMC issues up front, then presented them the figures for their jurisdiction, their local jurisdiction, and then asked them to kind of speak to whether there were any trends in parity or disparity and what they think might be going on during those periods of parity or disparity. And I mean, a number of interesting things came up. I think some of which relate to Dr. Warren's presentation, which I'll get to in a bit, but I think there's also some other important implications for what we think the law enforcement's role is and kind of disparities that may exist. First, I think officers primarily saw what they were arresting non-white youth for, or youth for in general, was really based on these legal factors. So offense seriousness, the youth's role in the actual offense, whether there was an injury to the victim. So it really wasn't about the youth, the call, anything like that. It was really focused on these kind of strong legal factors. At least that's what kind of came up most commonly in these surveys. Next, outside of Salt Lake, West Valley, and some of the other, and the unified districts here in Utah, which tend to be the larger ones in this kind of region, other jurisdictions reported that they didn't notice any differences in offending by race. However, in these larger jurisdictions, Salt Lake, West Valley, unified districts, officers tended to report that non-whites were engaging in more offending behavior, which was therefore increasing the contact with law enforcement. So with that being said, we thought, okay, well, what do officers think about DMC, whether it exists? What did they know about it? I know the state's done a lot of work, CCJJ, Brett's office, many others have been heavily involved at this high level of working on initiatives to kind of help reduce the disparities that we're seeing, especially at these arrest and referral stages. And what we found is that officers generally lack familiarity with the concepts related to DMC. I mean, with the exception of implicit bias training and cultural awareness training, they were reported oftentimes that they were somewhat or had limited familiarity with even the concept of DMC, racial ethnic disparities, just kind of common terms that the DMC coordinator in our state is going around and kind of presenting on these issues, and there's just something is not kind of connecting or resonating in the messages from the state or the administrations and these law enforcement agencies. So the message isn't being conveyed to you know, kind of the line staff, the officers, what these concepts are, what does the problem look like, what do we think, what might be going on with this, and trying to really answer the questions, like I think Dr. Warren said, you know, the mechanisms behind what's driving these disparities. And not only were they unfamiliar with these concepts, they were also unfamiliar with these larger scale initiatives. So we sifted through CCJJ's you know, summary of all of their meetings, and looked through everything that had been done. So there have been curriculums that were developed for school resource officers. There's been other kind of trainings, things like that. We listed all of these out. And again, the officers' familiarity with these initiatives and things that they, quite frankly, had been going through in trainings were still quite low. So again, it's like there's this kind of wearing effect or kind of waning effect after time where it's, you know, the message is being lost, the trainings are kind of being forgotten. And so what kind of came from this is, you know, we were like thinking that it's important to kind of present these longitudinal trends for officers just to get their perceptions of how things have been changing within their local jurisdictions. And in most instances, as Brett mentioned, for other decision points as well, the disparities exist and they've been pretty consistent over time. But there were instances where we've seen precipitous declines and in some instances increases in disparities. But we wanted to get the officers' perceptions. And one of the things that came up a fair amount in terms of when we would see instances of parity was that the officers explained that away as by being a byproduct of the Ferguson effect. So the reason that we're seeing parity in their jurisdiction is because officers are actually scared to do their job, afraid to make arrests. And so therefore, that's why we're seeing parity. They would, very few instances where they would liken it to some kind of policy or training that they had gone through. So we found that quite interesting. In issues of disparity, there was some kind of evidence that not all officers were aware of these implicit bias trainings, and so they were making the point that they actually felt that these trainings could serve a purpose. In one instance, one officer mentioned that they hadn't been exposed to these trainings, but they were aware of these trainings, and that they think that they could have some kind of impact on reducing disparities. Officers also mentioned that disparities were most commonly, you know, why they're being observed is because school truancy issues. So we wanted to kind of get away from school issues, but we couldn't disentangle the arrest and referral data enough to kind of disaggregate by you know, school referral versus kind of you know, another call for service or a referral from the community. So, but officers oftentimes said that school truancy issues really led to this disparity in their jurisdictions. They felt that it increased the contact with law enforcement, and that schools are often strapped by resources. So they lack the alternatives beyond getting youth involved in the formal justice process. Now, I assume some of this is going to change, or a lot of this has changed since the non-judicial adjustments piece that came in. But again, we were asking about longitudinal trends. So some of this went back prior to the NJA legislation. And then lastly, I think there's an inherent distrust in kind of the data that we proposed to or presented to the officers. It really, a number of instances that came up that these data must be incorrect. This doesn't occur in our jurisdiction. We know it's not occurring in our jurisdiction. So this data is incorrect, but these were, you know, data coming from the state. So we had no involvement in the data besides just entering them and kind of putting them into these trend maps or line graphs for them to read. But again, there was this inherent thought process that these data were somehow incorrect, that they don't see this occurring in their jurisdiction, that they really focus on the legal factors, what the law is, they're responding to calls for service. And these are the things that they're presented with. And so they stick to the law and the legislation. And unfortunately, that's why we're seeing these disparities. But I also want to say that there were a number of good things that came from this study. And I think that this is important, and it kind of ties in with some other things that have been mentioned. I think the law enforcement community, so we conducted some follow-up interviews with a small subsample of law enforcement officers, and a number of them indicated that partnerships are key. That one of the things that they've seen success with is that, and that they feel is actually driving disparities, is these cultural barriers that exist between the police and the communities that they're serving. So again, the law enforcement officers tend to be white, and they're policing kind of Hispanic or non-white communities. And there's different cultural aspects of that. There's language barriers there. The juvenile justice process can be complex. And so when they're getting letters from the juvenile courts or the juvenile justice system, you know, there's an interpretation issue on certain things. And so a couple of the agencies told us that they found a lot of success by partnering with other community members and stakeholders and trying to work with them, law enforcement and other community partners, to help break down some of these cultural barriers. So hiring interpreters to work for them, to change all of the forms, legal forms, anything like that, so that it can be in Spanish. Another thing is too that they can link with community partners and have a better sense of different service providers that are working in those communities, so that they can have a more a more informed kind of decision point where, like, does this really need to result in an arrest? If there's a chance that they can refer them to some other service. I think Brett also made a good point. The receiving centers are helping with that as well. And then also one thing that came up that the agencies felt that was also particularly successful was having them kind of work with youth in non-white communities in like a more kind of pro-social setting. So serving as more of like a mentor role, thinking about how they can get involved in sports leagues with the youth, how they can, attend after school programs with them and work in other things that are a little bit more in a non kind of confrontational setting, which can help also increase the, police legitimacy, make youth of color feel like the police aren't there to kind of work against them, but they're there as a support system as well. So I think that those were a couple of things that came up in the interviews as well.
So
yes.
Derek, I think we've got a few people that are firing away at questions for the entire group and for you. So I just want to kind of take a step back, just because the incredible work that you and Dr. Prince have done from UCJC, as well as others, certainly from UCJC long before I got here. This is a report that I correct me if I'm wrong, Derek, but this is a report that will be released at some point on UCJC's website. So I want to make sure that we can link people to that if possible. Just wanting to let the audience know that there's a lot of rich data, as Derek is mentioning, that are really critical to understanding this problem. And it's related to a question that was asked several minutes ago from Jackie Chamberlain, and I just want to bring it to the entire panelists' attention. So how do we get law enforcement to really be a part of these conversations? Well, first off, we've started to do that, certainly. It's easy for policyholders and researchers and those who are passionate about this work to be involved in the conversations, but it seems difficult to encourage law enforcement to come to the table and to own their contribution to the problem, particularly in schools. And that's what we struggle with in Utah. Great question, Jackie. Thank you for asking it. I, again, have a number of thoughts about that, particularly around the label of disproportionate minority contact, which, as I understand it, this is not my area of expertise in particular, but as I understand it, that label has even been changed to racial and ethnic disparities.
Yep.
In part because it seems as if it is all police officers' fault, and it isn't. It is part of the problem, but they also were part of the solution.
I think that one thing that I just was writing down in my notes, and this is just kind of more of a general concept that I think helps illuminate some of these issues. I was in this, a conversation similar to this, talking about racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice, but I was having the conversation with the heads of, child welfare and mental health and service for people with disability. And mental health and service for people with disabilities, they have disproportionality, but the other way. I mean, so they're underrepresented people of color. And so that just speaks to this larger systemic issue that raises its head and is just a little clearer. You know, it's a little easier to put our finger on in criminal justice. So it, you know, that's the call, kind of the call to action I've given to all of my agencies. Like, look, we're right in the heart of this issue. We can't back away from the quest to establish equitable systems. Like, we're a part of it. Like, we have to be engaged. But to think that it's just solved in that one lens or one lane is I think a little bit naive, you know, and so, you know, I think it is. I wish this was less of a platitude and something more actionable. It is actionable. It just takes a lot of damn time, and that is just getting to the table with people, like constantly putting the hand out and saying, I'm going to walk into this as a partner, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And, you know, with law enforcement, with schools, we disintegrate and we fall apart when we just are pointing the fingers. And I think Utah's journey relative to school-based referrals is actually an interesting example. So when juvenile reform was first passed in 2017, it eliminated the ability to refer to juvenile court for any school-based offenses. You know, complete elimination. So, but there's more. So wait, Dr. Warren, I'm going to give you the rest of the story. But it's a good story. I think it's a journey that we're on. We have some amazingly committed legislators that understand this issue and are just front and center on the issue and stick with it. So that was just a hard line in the sand. You know, as a system, we maybe weren't at a point we were ready for that. Maybe we were. Some could disagree and go back and forth on that. Ultimately, what came about was the next year, the next legislative session, they created a path where you still could refer for school-based offenses. You had to have some diversions, but there was going to be a sunset, and it was going to end, and that ability to refer for school-based offenses was going to end in 2 years. We revisited it again last year. So we have a sunset still, but now there's an additional layer, which is a diversion, another diversionary aspect. And it's not just based on an assessment and then you can refer. It's based on, you know, they weren't able to successfully engage in some of these services. So there's this continual process, but it has a sunset on it where that will end. That, you know, I don't know. Ultimately, I want to get to a place where we don't have those school-based referrals, but also recognizing that in this space, my partners are school administrators. It is the state school board. It is law enforcement. So we have to come to the table and say, you know, maybe it's not exactly where I want it, but let's find a path where we can get there together. And I think Utah is an example of that. I think so in a couple of years that will sunset. And we did see a dramatic reduction. I don't know, Van or Derek, you have the numbers off the top of your head, but our school-based referrals dropped to, I think they were like 100 last year. I mean, it was a significant decrease. So you know, we're on that path, but it's taking that kind of concerted effort to say, okay, let's walk into this policy together, knowing that there's a lot of different interests to serve.
Yeah, that is so exciting to hear, actually. So the first thing I'll say is these are difficult conversations to have, even amongst the groups of us who generally agree that it's a problem, right? So whenever someone asks a question, you know, will they come to the table? There's ways of getting them to the table. It just is about trust. So in North Carolina, when I was working on the Juvenile Black Project, we partnered with the Highway Patrol, and we worked because their first question for us is, you just want to tell everybody that we are racially biased and engage in racially biased policing, and the media is going to come attack us. And, you know, it was a big project in North Carolina, and the media was doing what they do, which is to gather the information. And in some instances, they were trying to force us to tell them who the bad apples were in the Highway Patrol. What we wanted them to see was that everybody wins if we partner to talk about what it is you're doing and how you plan to move forward. And so if there are disparities, where do they lie and how can you address them? Or are they about behavior, or is it something about the behavior of your officers? And so what we found in North Carolina was there was a criminal interdiction team that did almost all the searches on the highway. They would just decide who they would search. So you had about 13 officers responsible for 98% of all searches in North Carolina. Now that seems crazy. You have 2,000 highway patrolmen in the state, and you have 13 officers on one team responsible for 98% of the searches. So what we started to see over time was they started to decline in the number of searches because we raised their attention to it. We brought it to their attention that this is what you're doing. And then when you stop them, some people you're searching and you're just searching them because you want to, you know, because if a police officer comes up to you and says, "Can I search your car?" Most of us are going to say yes, because we don't know that we can say no.
Unless you're white.
Right, unless,
like privileged to be able to say no.
Right, because I would never say to a police
if you're a
officer,
person of color, you don't.
You cannot search my car, even though I legally, and I have a PhD, so I legally know I can say no, but I would not say no because that interaction could escalate to something else, right? And so some of this is the conversation is difficult to have. Now, we are in a particular moment right now where we can take advantage of the ability to talk about it. The project that I've been talking about was going on in 2000 when we weren't having a conversation about racial profiling, and it was very hard to have the conversation about race. And even then, police officers were saying, well, we don't know about racial profiling. We don't know about disparities. And if they exist, none of us ever do it. That is the long-term conversation of law enforcement. And I think that's where we have an opportunity to say, we're not even saying you're racially biased. We just want you to see what your numbers and what your patterns look like. And can you explain them?
You know, and my area of expertise is really focuses primarily on correctional staff, which is not, it is a form of law enforcement.
Sure.
What I find is that, you know, working with correctional staff, it's similar to working with policing in the sense that the approach that we have with folks, if people feel attacked from day one, they are not going to be involved in the conversation. How we frame these conversations matters. The fact that we have this false dichotomy right now, and it's particularly hard, I'll be honest, with, you know, folks like me who, you know, are definitely understanding that we need law enforcement of some kind, but yet Black Lives Matter. Like, it's a false dichotomy that we can't have solutions on both sides. And so we're forced into pigeonholing, and also have to recognize that law enforcement are part of and assimilated into a culture that is not of their own doing.
Yep.
Right? For whatever culture, you know, Blue Lives Matter, right? Like everything that we're seeing in social media, and of course, I mean, this stuff matters, and that they're embedded in that culture. So having strong leadership, having strong conversations about, like, we get that it's not just about bad apples. That's certainly part of the problem, but it's also about creating a culture and environment where people can be honest too, and how these solutions are going to come about. So I think framing the conversation in the right way to get law enforcement involved is really important. And for law enforcement to recognize that they may not have intended to be racist, but that has been the perception and the feeling across many communities of color, and to come to that kind of reckoning place. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of strong character of leadership.
And that it's okay. So police officers have grown up in the same social world that the rest of us have grown up in, right? The same racialized, segregated world. I mean, they're a part of it. And so to presume that now they're police officers and somehow they're going to throw away history just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so I think our ability to talk with them about it without demonizing them, even in the face of the most heinous things that they've done, it is, can we talk about why this is problematic? Yeah. So why is it okay to shoot someone 7 times in their back? Can we have that conversation with you without you feeling indicted, picked on, disrespected? But can you explain how an interaction where someone is technically not even under arrest leads to their death? Can you walk us through that interaction? And I think it is a hard conversation to have, but I think it's necessary. And our ability to do it, I even say this to my students, you cannot, particularly around race, you have to understand that any conversation about race is sensitive, but you have to be able to have it nevertheless.
And a lot of people are forced to have it without the training and know-how and knowledge.
That's exactly right.
And so we're elevating.
And that's why I think leadership is so important, right? Because if we can get leadership to the table, that's where it starts. Like this notion of training, when people say training, they usually hear diversity training. That's not what I mean. I mean that in the academy, we are saying to police officers, let me explain to you not just implicit bias, but sometimes your own bias and how you might recognize it and diffuse it and work towards diffusing it in interactions that don't have to escalate. But that requires a community of leadership in the law enforcement community to be a part of that conversation and to be willing to just admit that there's some things that shouldn't happen.
Yeah. I think
it's hard to get them there.
Yeah, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't think law enforcement need to be a part of the conversation for sure.
That's exactly right. They have to be at the table. Yeah. They have to have a seat at the table.
Yeah. Other comments before I go to another Q&A? Van, Derek, Brett, anything on that?
I just have a question. I think this is, to the whole panel. I'm curious because, listening to Derek and presenting the information from a law enforcement perspective and all your guys' comments about, it's such a sensitive issue. Automatically, it goes to like an individual level. And I just want to share with you a quote on my own study looking at this. And this is a 15-year-old female identified as African American. And when asked why she believes that we have the issue of DMC, or now referred to as RED, she said it's racism. And you can start all the way back with slavery, which was abolished in 1865. And that allowed Black people more votes. But then we had Jim Crow laws. And those were endorsed to kind of prevent them. And then you have Black people feeling that this is so unfair that we have to move north. And once they move north, then you have gentrification. And that's where the inner city starts, and that connects with schools. Or in this case, in Salt Lake, the West Side have more police officers and school resource officers and have higher rates of referrals. So it kind of all becomes really connected with the roots of racism. So it's kind of hard to know where to start with all of that because you can trace it so far back. And so I just think it's a huge part of just American society. This is a 15-year-old youth.
Yeah, get her in our doctoral program immediately.
And so while I do agree we have to have law enforcement and the whole community part of training in this discussion, it almost feels like we need to have another school lesson to rewrite those history books, present other history books, not from only the side of the quote unquote winners, right, of the Civil War. But it's just so interesting that a youth can have this perspective at age 15, and we have individuals who are unwilling to not look at the issue of race and ethnic disparities as an individual level, but as a systemic problem. And so my question is, do we know of any jurisdiction or a national level, it's not just training police officers, but it's actually unlearning, unpacking, and re-educating. And I don't want to just put the focus on law enforcement. It's our communities, it's our education, it's policymakers. Like, how amazing is that, Dr. Warren, that you guys can have racial impact statements on legislation? Our office actually pushed out a bill last year, the Sentencing Commission, to have that, and it wasn't passed. And I think that, highlights the difficulty we have in changing this narrative.
I'm sorry.
I would just also, I just would also add to, I think we need to have more voices of youth who've been affected by this too. So thank you for bringing in her voice. I think that's something we need to be thinking about as everybody being a part of the community and part of the solution. We need more people who are particularly affected. Thank you, Dr. Warren.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the 15-year-old, so in many Black and brown communities, we have to teach this to our children. We don't get to tell our kids, you could just be free and do whatever you want. We have to say that you must be attentive to when a police officer, I'll never forget my mom telling me the same thing. When you drive, when a police officer comes to your car, you put your hands up, you stay still, you don't move unless he tells you to move. Like, your deference is to him. And so it's not surprising that that student of color said that she understood that it's entrenched in American history. But I think if you want to have a conversation about this, or if you want to address it, right? So if we want to disrupt patterns, we have to get them to the table first, right? And that's the reality. You have to get them to the table. And the way to get them to the table is to go to individuals. And usually I think it's leadership, because I think leadership is in the power to do things, right? They can control the kinds of resources, what gets rewarded, what didn't. During the drug war, part of the reason they started using no-knock warrants and battering rams and knocking down doors and searching all those vehicles was in part a function of the federal government saying, you get to keep a portion of whatever it is you seize. So if you seize $100,000, you get to keep a portion of that. Well, that's an incentive to misbehave, right? So we can't incentivize bad behavior, but we still have to get them to the table to talk about it. And then you can highlight how entrenched and ingrained these problems are. I think the academy is a great way to get at them, because it does have to be, if it's going to be unlearned, it's going to happen in the academy, because we can't presume that that they're going to unlearn these processes even at the university level, because even though we're having this conversation, university community broadly are struggling themselves to have this. The ivory tower is struggling to have this conversation about the ways in which it's structuring who gets promoted, who gets tenured, who becomes an administrator, who doesn't. And so I think the problem of race and ethnicity in America has permeated every social institution because of how ingrained it is. And so I just think police are a particular kind of community because they have the power to take someone's life. And I think that's why we have to try to disrupt this. We have to try to interject in this conversation every place we can. And unfortunately, it's at the individual level that we can do it, because I think if we can find individuals who are willing to change and address this, we can start thinking about what kind of policies can be changed in schools and what school boards can do. School boards, I don't know if it's like this in Utah, but in Florida, school boards are very powerful entities. They have a say about what the superintendent will actually do. And so if you get school boards on board and say, look, you can't keep suspending all these kids. You need to find alternative ways to punish them. You would be surprised how administrators will find alternative ways to punish them. And so that's the kind of thing that I think about has to happen, and has to happen in local jurisdictions across the United States.
Well, and I think too, it's important, being now embedded in a college of social work, which is new to me as a criminologist, right? We're hearing a lot more, of course. I'm hearing a lot more about understanding certainly the amounts of trauma and victimization. And for many of these youth, this is a social service issue. It's not a punishment issue, right? But we want to treat it as if it's a punishment issue. And we have historically been doing so. And it is hard, really hard to undo the ways in which we do business, so to speak, and to relearn and to take a step back and pull back the curtains again about why we have school resource officers in schools to begin with, as a reaction to Columbine. Earlier this month, we had another scholar, Dr. Jamelia Blake, speak to us about the adultification of young Black girls, right? And the understanding that they are seen as more culpable, they are seen as more responsible, they are seen as if they are not worthy of support and resources by folks in school. So those conversations become really important too, to be thinking about how we intervene, and certainly sometimes not intervening at all, because we can create more harm by doing so. Even, when I hear about the youth service centers or the centers where we're going to not necessarily divert, but bring people resources, it is plausible to be thinking about even bringing kids to resource centers can be problematic, right? Can be potentially risky, can expose them to ideas that maybe they don't even need. I'm not suggesting we don't need the resource centers, of course, but how we carefully refer matters.
So
Yeah,
I have a question, Dr. Patterson, how did you all, I have two questions for you. How did you shrink the doorway to juvenile justice? And how did you convince them to start referring kids from school?
so both of those were really just policy constraints. So legislation was passed. So, and Van, I know you saw Van put in the chat. So truancies before our kind of landmark juvenile reform, I think the last year reporting before that was a little over 1,000 referrals for truancy. This last year it was 172. So they still can make a referral, but like I said, there's these kind of layers and steps. On the detention side of things, like I said, it was just literally putting it right in policy. Here's what you can refer. You know, here's where a kid can be admitted to detention. Here's when they can't. And then even a step further, the state, my agency, you know, working with the courts, developing a detention risk assessment tool. So even if they're brought to the doors for something that would otherwise be bookable, they still do this assessment and divert. And that's one, I mean, actually our diversions at the point of detention to our risk assessment tool, those have been fairly proportional, is one area where I think we are seeing, you know, a level application of the policy and intent. But yeah, that's very specifically how we went at the issue. And I think that where this kind of, I think, in my mind, and whenever I'm talking on this issue, is where it's I kind of all kind of coalesce back and it comes together, is really what Dr. Salisbury is talking about, is finding ways as systems to, we've got to be able to serve kids right in their home schools and communities, and breaking down the barriers, whether it's in the justice realm or the child welfare realm, to say, look, we don't have to take them anywhere. We don't have to take them out of their home to get these services. What juvenile reform in Utah has done, which has been dramatic, and I think it will be dramatic over the next, you know, X number of years, 5 number of years, is being serve kids in their home schools and communities, not having to come into, like you said, whether it's a center or a detention, certainly, you know, continue to take those steps to meet kids right where they're at and just serve them right where they're at, because that's where I think we have our very best shot.
I also think, you know, there's been quite a few folks in my world of criminology who've just assumed that kids are just as dangerous as adults too, and that's been a whole other issue in terms of developing risk assessments, particularly for girls, which is an issue that I do a lot of work in and think about a lot, assuming that girls are just as risky as boys. And that boys are just as risky as adult men, of course, which is not the case. So, I mean, yeah, I think the responsibility is on all of us to continue to have the conversation and to be, as many others have said, to be uncomfortable with, to get comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations. And if we're not having the conversations, then we're not doing the service for our youth, for our children, and for all children. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to share too, I love, you know, Van kind of talked about kind of the silent histories. Obviously that's a broader issue, and, you know, my wife's a history teacher, and, you know, she's doing her master's degree right now. And so, you know, that's just part of the scholarship, you know, making sure we are looking at silent histories, the silent aspects of our history. But, you know, into some of the conversation earlier of how do we move the needle on some of these issues, you know, for my agency, I agree with, I mean, there are specific policies or specific practices, but really just starting the conversation. And so actually Van was able to join my team. I had all of my leaders, you know, from around the state last week, where we literally, it wasn't about a training. It wasn't a diversity training. It was, we're going to unpack this. You know, we're going to get shared language. We're going to have a shared understanding. We are going to look at the data as well. and then we're going to talk. And it was impactful. And now we're going to take it to the next layer. You know,
Yeah.
we're going to go to our supervisors. And I think that's about, I mean, we're bumping our head along the way. We definitely, I don't have the answer. I mean, I'm just going as a very willing and hopeful participant.
But it takes leadership,
but I think
Brett, right? That kind of leadership to be able to say, we're going to do it. And so I want to applaud your efforts. I know that's not what you're
Thank you.
asking for, but like, that's the kind of leadership that we need to have the courage to be able to have those conversations and to lay it out on the table. And I appreciate it.
And to Brett's point, I think in Utah, we have really good partnerships with Brett at Juvenile Justice Services, with our partners at Juvenile Court. We're very data-driven. Those two agencies and working with our office are so willing to give the data, so willing to be transparent. And that's where we start. And I think being able to push, you know, as big of a package as the reform, it's also the continuation of it. It's not just the end, right? To what Brett said about the detention risk assessment tool and the non-judicial adjustments for diversion, those are still areas that we want to continue looking at and how they're impacting racial and ethnic youth. And then being able to take it a step further, because while we are based on evidence and research, as I imagine other policy arenas, there's always some sort of sacrifice as well that may not be based on research, right? So for example, the detention risk assessment tool, there's also override criteria that was developed not based on statistical methods, but of what the community's concerns were. And so I think moving forward, I think we have a really great partnership with the state leadership, but probably one area where we're lacking, and, you know, we are committed, is more community outreach to those local school boards, not just at a state level, to, you know, how do we encourage entities outside of the justice systems to be willing to run for these school board and city council positions from these vulnerable populations. I think the juvenile justice system needs help from other systems as well in being able to mobilize and move the needle. I think, unfortunately, we are quick to blame. We're quick to look at the system and at one point and said, what are you guys doing? What are you doing to cause this problem? And of course, we have to have that individual ownership. But once again, we're an ecosystem. These systems interact with each other. And so to be able to come together and get on the same page, I think that's still something that Utah is struggling with, from a state to a local school level and community, as well as local law enforcement agencies.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, I have a lot to say and a lot on my mind and a lot of good things that Dr. Nguyen, you just mentioned. Any other sort of parting shots? We've got about 5 minutes left. I feel like this has been a really good dialogue. I've found it very useful for me just to sort of learn the ins and outs of certainly what's going on in Florida and in Utah. There are a couple more questions that I wonder if we just might tackle here. Looks like Paula Smith asked Derek, does a lack of familiarity suggest that this information needs to be presented and reinforced in academy training? And I'm pretty sure this meant, you know, the law enforcement piece about bringing in training on in the academy. Have there been discussions on that?
No, from my understanding though, and kind of linking their lack of familiarity with their, and two, within those terminologies, we asked them whether they were familiar with the DMC coordinator position, and officers oftentimes said somewhat familiar, very limited familiarity with them. And then when we kind of asked or pressed a little bit more in some follow-up interviews, they felt like that there's been a lot of turnover in that position, so they're not sure what the role is. There's been, you know, stability issues. So I think, you know, while some of this can be addressed in the academy training, I think, yes, certainly we want to address what we can there and kind of expose them to this as much as possible, and then obviously have refreshers or bring this up. I think one thing that's kind of useful that I've seen in Ohio, and then even mentioned maybe somewhat in some of the interviews here in Utah from officers, is that there's somewhat of this distrust when you have someone from CCJJ or, you know, some other state level organization in Ohio, or researchers coming in and presenting data on their arrest records. So it's kind of like we're coming in there and telling them, like, and this has been brought up by Brett and others as well, you know, we're pointing the finger at them, like, here's what we're seeing in the data. You know, so what we found in Ohio that was particularly successful in a different context, but kind of running groups that had very fruitful discussion on these topics, was that we had officers that had their master's degree from the University of Cincinnati that were kind of aware of these larger issues, running these focus groups, talking to the officers themselves. And the participation was, it's like night and day from what we saw when court, you know, Dr. Prince and I were working on these surveys and interviews. You know, there was like immediately this kind of wall up between us, whereas in Ohio, when we were working with them, you know, during these focus groups, and officers were kind of going in there, and most of them were higher level, you know, or at least in terms of their supervisory position, were in supervisory positions. And so they were able to kind of go in and control this narrative a bit more and say, like, here, look, these numbers are legit. I'm one of you guys. I'm telling you about these issues. And they opened up and started talking about these issues a little bit more candidly than I think what we saw in the surveys and interviews. So I think, you know, thinking about, and then I've also seen in the juvenile courts there in Ohio, something that was also particularly helpful is having an in-house DMC coordinator. So they had someone that was working like a liaison with the state, but also conveying that information in-house to their people. So it was someone embedded in their system, in their culture already, that kind of helps break down some of those walls. So you can at least move the discussion a bit forward, rather than getting hung up on, like, someone's in here telling me I'm doing this wrong. I don't know where they get these data from, even though we've, you know, clearly told them where the data were coming from, but there was this level of distrust. And I think those are a couple of things. But yes, to answer your question, I do think some of these trainings, you know, need to be done, and done so frequently. And we also need more evaluation work on these too. So we've seen a lot of things like implicit bias training, cultural sensitivity training, this and that. But we don't know a lot about how effective they've been, especially within the justice system. So, I mean, it's worked in other areas, but again, you know, I think it's important for us to see.
It could make a problem worse. I mean,
exactly.
It could make doing implicit bias training could root people further into their biases if it's not done right, or if we don't really know, right? I mean, I'm not personally convinced that doing implicit bias training is the sole solution. I think that's, of course, part of the discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think those are really important points, evaluating what can work to start, you know, dispelling, and remembering judges too. I know, to be quite honest, I've known a few judges who throw girls of color into detention just because they think it's, you know, for their quote own good. Having those conversations, certainly with all stakeholders too, matters. Wow.
So I just wanted to say this before we go. So I have this fun little exercise that any one of you can do, right? So who wants to be the volunteer to do it? So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. It should only take about a minute to do. So who wants to agree to do it? Dr. Peterson has agreed to do it. Of course he's agreed to do it.
Did you just tell me?
Yes, I did kind of
Okay.
told you. I think that's what I just did. Okay, it's really quick and it's fun. Okay, so this is measuring implicit bias. Okay, so what I want you to do, Dr. Peterson, is I only want you to tell me in each one of them, and I want you to do it in a rhythm. So I want you to tell me the color you see. All right, go.
Down this way?
Yep, you can go all the way down 1, all the way down 2, all the way down 3.
Okay.
Let's go.
Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, brown, red, yellow, black, blue, purple.
Do it again.
green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, brown, blue, yellow, black, blue, purple.
Do it again.
Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, brown, blue, yellow, black, blue, purple.
You see how hard it was by the time you got to the second one?
Sure.
That's how implicit bias works. The moment you start and you form whatever you have in your head, by the time you get to your decision point, you're already there. So you have to reprogram your mind to undo what you just taught your mind to do. That's how, and we're asking officers to do this in quick moments when there's time to make decisions, right? You're asking school administrators to do it. You're asking teachers to do it and judges to do it. And this is how quickly our mind can form a set of ideas. And it's hard to undo it without careful thought. So you were able to get through, most people can't even get through it. You were able to get through it because you slowed your pace down, right? You said, wait a minute, I have to be deliberate and methodical in my decision making. And that is what we need more officials, both in schools and in the justice system, to be attentive to when they're making decisions. Thanks for being a good sport, Dr. Peterson.
Excellent.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for volunteering me.
That's such an important point, such an important point. And we know research tells us bias happens, like you said, Dr. Warren, bias is more likely to come out when we have to make quick, life-changing decisions and really high-stakes decisions that are quick. So I just, that's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. So I just wanted to, again, sort of close us out and really thank all our audience, thank our speakers for planting some seeds of solutions. To our audience, thank you for daring to care. We hope we've inspired you in some small way to turn your caring into action and to continue to learn more. Stay tuned to the College of Social Work's social media feed for the many exciting talks going on across campus. I'm particularly excited about the conversation that our social work dean Teasley and our law school dean Kronk Warner will be having on the book White Fragility on September 2nd. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again to all our speakers. I really appreciate it. And I hope this is only the beginning of our conversation and certainly not the end. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.